Chelik Chof Aleph, Volume 21, the second Sicha for Parshas B'Shalach. This Sicha will explain the Chabad custom that we do not wash for bread for Seudah Shlishis, for the third meal on Shabbos afternoon. Rather, we make sure to eat something, but something rather small, just to take, as it's called, te'ima, to taste something. So let's familiarize ourselves with the verse, which is the source of all of this, meaning the source of the 3 meals of Shabbos in the first place, and also specifically, as will be discussed in the Sicha, the particulars of the halacha and the custom pertaining to the third meal on Shabbos. So remember, the Jews received the manna, the man, in the desert, and they were instructed very specifically, very emphatically, not to collect extra, not to leave over for the next day. But however, when it came Friday, they had double. And then it came Shabbos morning, they realized, well, we have leftovers from yesterday. Should we eat it? Should we not eat it? Should we go out and collect man as we did the other 6 days, the past 6 days? So they come to Moshe, and in chapter 16, verse 25, Moshe says, Vayomer Moshe said to them, Ichluhu hayom, eat this today. Ki Shabbos hayom l'Hashem, because today is Shabbos to Hashem. Hayom lo yisimtzu, today you will not find it. So 3 times he mentions the word hayom, today, and from here the Chazal derive the mitzvah, the obligation of eating 3 meals on Shabbos. The next point to be familiar with, typically in halacha, whenever a meal is required in order to commemorate or celebrate something, typically that means that one has to do with bread. Bread is the ideal way to fulfill the obligation of having a meal. However, there is an alternative, which is considered to be almost like a second best option, and that is if you eat something like cake, something that's made from flour, and it does not have the full constitution of bread, which you do not make hamoitzi on it, but rather boire mine mizonos. Another thing to be familiar with is the fundamental concept, in other words, the underlying reason, as will be explained in the Sicha, for many of the obligations of Shabbos, for example, like having a meal or the meals and so on. And that is, as it says, and we say it Shabbos by day, by Kiddush, it says in the prophet, V'karasa la Shabbos oinik. Literally translated, you should call for Shabbos. You should call, it means you should address Shabbos and bring it to be oineg, a pleasure. So this is very, very fundamentally connected to some of the things that we must do on Shabbos, and that is to have a pleasurable time in the literal sense, meaning physically, materially, have a pleasurable time. Another thing to be familiar with, there is a debate, without getting into the full details, as to what does it mean when we say Olam Haba, the world to come. Now, meaning the ultimate stage of the existence of the world after Mashiach comes. In short, Chassidus accepts and rules in accordance with the opinion of the Ramban, Nachmanides, that he says that this is a reference to the ultimate time period, which is after Tchias HaMesim, after the resurrection of the dead, that will have the actual souls come back down from Gan Eden, all the souls of the past thousands of years, and they'll come into bodies, and that is the ultimate existence. So let's get into the Sicha. As we mentioned in the introduction, from this verse that Moshe said to them, eat it today, for today is Shabbos to Hashem, today you will not find it, this is where the Chazal derive the obligation of eating 3 meals. Now, although typically, as we said, a meal constitutes eating bread, yet when in regards to the third meal of Shabbos, we actually find a machloikis, a debate that's quoted in Shulchan Aruch. I mean, it's quoted lahalacha. There's opinions that say, no, you must fulfill this obligation by eating bread, just like any other meal. However, there's a opinion, there's a daya that says, no, you don't need to eat bread necessarily, but it can be somewhat of a quote-unquote miniature meal, meaning you can fulfill your obligation with mizonos, with various types of cakes or cookies and things like that. Then there's an opinion that takes it even further and says, no, you don't have to eat bread, you don't even have to eat cakes and that type of stuff. Rather, you have to eat food of significance, food that usually would come with bread, like meat, fish, or something like that. And then there's an opinion that takes it even further and says, no, you don't have to do any of the above. Rather, you just have to eat something. You can eat just fruits or anything or in our case, maybe candy or something, you just have to put something in your mouth, so to speak. Now, the Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch writes the following. He says, "Ve'ein lismoich klal al kol zeh." You should not rely at all on any of this, and any of these opinions, only if there's no other choice. Meaning, if a person is in a situation where they just cannot eat, for example, if they're very full, they ate too much at the second meal, meaning the first meal of the day, then if they cannot eat, then there's no, of course, you should not, cause yourself aggravation or pain on Shabbos, and therefore you don't have to eat bread. But otherwise, the Alter Rebbe says, do not rely on these opinions at all. That's the Alter Rebbe, that's halacha. Yet, and here comes the Sicha, yet we know, it's well known and well documented, the minhag of all our Rebbes, going back throughout all the generation of the Chabad Rebbes, that in almost all the cases, in Ruba de Ruba of all cases, they did not eat bread at this meal, and rather they fulfilled the obligation of Suda Shlishis by just eating something small, by just, quote, Te'ima kolshuhu, by just tasting something, like fruit or something like that. Now, what is the reason? Of course, the basic reason is because we know that the third time in the verse, the third Hayoim, the third, quote-unquote, today, is mentioned in conjunction with the word loi, no. In other words, in a negative. It says, today you will not find the man. Today you will not go out for it. In other words, there is the shlilas mitzias amon. And therefore, it's befitting that the fulfillment, the implementation of this third meal, which is referred to, which is hinted in the word Hayoim Loi, should also be in somewhat of a not doing it. In other words, not having a full meal, rather just fulfilling it by having just something. Now, this is the halachic explanation. The esoteric explanation for it is, as explained in Chassidus, that since the third meal of the day corresponds to the Shabbos of La'osid Lavai, the Shabbos of the future, meaning the ultimate time, which, by the way, it's not only in Chassidus, the Bach also brings it down, who was one of the pillars of halacha, that since this corresponds to, and this hints to, the ultimate of times, and what does the Gemara say about this time period, about Le'asid Lavai? Quote, it says, Oilam haba, the world to come, ein boi lo yachila v'lo yishtia, that there'll be no eating and no drinking in this time. That's what the Gemara says, and that taking it literally at its face value. Therefore, in other words, what does that really mean? That the spiritual energy, the existence that will be then, will come from an aspect of ayin, of naught, of not. In other words, from the highest aspect of things. And therefore, this meal, since this meal is correspondent to that time period, therefore it cannot be a regular meal. Rather, it has to be such that expresses the absence of eating of bread, expresses the naught, the ayin, the loy, as we said, is the purpose, is the aspect of the future. Now, we know that our Torah, our holy Torah, is one Torah. In other words, Pnimiyas HaTorah, the esoteric part of the Torah, the secret part of the Torah, Kabbalah, Chassidus, and the halacha part of the Torah, or we call the nigla part of the Torah, are seamlessly intertwined. Because it's one Torah, it's a seamless Torah. And therefore, when it comes out that according to Pnimiyas HaTorah, according to the way we just explained, according to the esoteric part of the Torah, that you should not eat bread in the Suda, it must be, in other words, we must explain it, we must understand it in such a manner that it doesn't come out to be somewhat of a kula, some kind of a leniency, or some kind of b'di'evet, like second best, plan B, but rather that this is consistent with halacha, both in actual practice and in the spirit of the halacha. Meaning that not only is it okay the way we're doing it according to Pnimiyas HaTorah, but rather that it's the most ideal implementation of the rule, and not chas v'shalom the opposite. And therefore we need to understand, it seems it seems, at least on the surface, that the way we explained it, according to Pnimius HaTorah, according to the esoteric part of the Torah, according to Kabbalah and Chassidus, it comes out, at least if you read the law, and especially the statement that the Alter Rebbe makes not to rely on these leniencies, it comes out that the way we do it, according to Pnimius HaTorah, seems to be a kula, a leniency, a second best, not the ideal. So the answer is as follows. In halacha itself, the Alter Rebbe writes, in regards to the 3 meals of Shabbos, he writes that the 3 meals of Shabbos are nothing but, meaning they're only for the purpose of oineg. Remember we said oineg is the fundamental quality of Shabbos. The Su'udah inherently is about oineg. In other words, the fact that we are obligated to eat a meal is not about that there's an essential obligation to eat bread, but rather that we eat bread, we eat a meal in order to derive oineg. And therefore, in halacha, in a case, in a situation where a person has not pleasure, but a person has tsar, a person has pain or discomfort from eating for whatever reason, either because they're sick or they're nauseous or whatever it is, then not only, api halacha, not only does the person not have to eat, but rather they have to not eat. In other words, not only they're not obligated to eat, now they have an obligation not to eat. Why? Because the fundamental root of the whole idea of eating on Shabbos is the idea of einig. And since in his case, in this scenario, this person has no einig from it, and the opposite, and the contrary, he'll have tsar from it, therefore he's not allowed to eat. Now, just like this is said in regards to eating on Shabbos in general, of course, it also applies to the particulars of what has to be eaten. That means in general, we said you don't have to eat if you don't feel good. Not only you don't have to eat, you're not allowed to eat. Now also in particular, what you have to eat, also this applies to. That if somebody has a problem with eating bread at a particular meal, for whatever reason, then not only he doesn't have to eat bread at that meal, but it comes out from these words of Alter Rebbe that he is forbidden to eat bread at that meal. And according to this, the fact that there is an obligation to eat bread at Shalosh Seudos, at Suda Shlishis, is only if you have pleasure from it. But in a case where to that person, to him, there is tsar from it, the person has pain from it, he has discomfort from it, then not only he doesn't have to eat bread, but as we explained, it will be forbidden for him to eat bread. And therefore, says the Rebbe, since this person believes with absolute complete faith that the time of Seudah Shlishis, at the time of, as it says in the Zohar, this is Raiva the Raivan, this is the highest level. In this time, what emanates, what is dominant, what shines in this time? The aspect of Hayoim Loi, which is the idea of naught, the Bechinas Ayin, which is like, in a sense, the same idea, Me'ein Yom HaKippurim, and on Yom Kippur, how do we commemorate that? How do we, so to speak, celebrate that? By not eating. So for this person, since he believes it with true faith, he may not fully understand it, but since he has absolute faith in this, therefore for him it would be a tsar, it would be discomforting, it would be painful for him to eat bread, and therefore for him it's forbidden to eat bread. So in other words, this person is doing the ideal implementation of halacha. Because for him, for that particular person who believes this staunchly, to the fullest extent, for that person, it's actually pleasurable not to eat bread. It would be a tsar to eat bread. And says the Rebbe, this is perhaps also you can say the reason for the custom by the Rabbeim that they ate something. They ate something. They didn't eat bread, but they ate something. Why? Because they really felt, they actually felt, they sensed the light that's going to shine, and that shines in the time of Suda Shlishis. Now they actually felt it. They actually saw it. They were in tune to it. We Chassidim, who are mekusher to them, we are connected to them by means of what? learning their Torah, and therefore we're absolutely connected to them, although we don't feel it, but we do the same, because we are mekusher to them. Okay, so now we understand the connection. However, there's still one matter that remains to be resolved. In other words, we still need to understand the following. If we say that in this time what's dominant is that aspect that's going to shine, that's going to be dominant in the time of La'asad Lava, Hayoim Loi, the idea of naught, the idea of ayin, then maybe we should have not eaten anything at all. We should eat nothing at all. And we find a precedent for this in the Zohar. The Zohar relates that on a Shabbos Erev Pesach, on the third meal, when it's a problematic, how do you eat the third meal? You're not allowed to eat anything because you have to be hungry for the matzah. But what do? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he substituted it with Divrei Torah. In other words, he didn't eat anything at all. Nothing. And what he did instead is he said Divrei Torah, and that was in the place of a meal. So why is it that there's still an obligation to eat something? And we find this actually in the writings of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, who quotes his father, and it's also quoted in Hayom Yom, the 22nd of Adar Aleph. He says the following, quote, the fact that Suda Shlishis, that the third meal is Hayom Loi, that means that you don't need to eat bread, says the Rebbe Rashab. However, you do need to eat something small. And then he continues and he says, the Amar Rabbi Yossi said, Yehei chelki me'oichle gimel sudis. It should be my lot, it should be my portion. That means I should be so lucky and have that great reward of those who eat the three meals. Now, from the fact that this is what the previous Rebbe is quoting his father as saying, so it comes out that there is a virtue in eating. Right? Okay, not bread, but there's a virtue in eating. And that brings us back to the question, why should we eat at all? Maybe we shouldn't eat anything because it's the aspect of Hayom Loi, right? Not ayin. So not eat nothing. That's one question. Another question is, he seems to be backing up his words to bring proof. He's bringing proof, that is, from Rabbi Yossi. But it's somewhat difficult to understand. Rabbi Yossi, first of all, does not address what should be eaten. He just says those who eat the three meals. How does that prove what the Rebbe Rashab is saying? That you shouldn't eat bread, but you should eat something. And exactly how does it serve as a proof? The answer lies in understanding what Rabbi Yossi really said. Because really the following question could be asked. What is he really saying? The fact that one has to eat three meals is a basic halacha. And usually this expression of, Yehei chelki, I should be my lot, it should be my portion, I should be so lucky to get this reward, typically is only used in reference to something which is a hidur mitzvah, which is an extra add-on in order to encourage people to do it. In other words, you don't go around indiscriminately saying this expression in regards to your regular average obligation, your regular average typical halacha. So from the fact that Rabbi Yossi is saying it, is telling you that this is not a typical thing. What is he saying exactly? The answer is that Rabbi Yossi was encouraging us to do something that otherwise maybe we wouldn't do. And why is that? Because as we said, the third meal corresponds to Olam Haba. So we need to understand. The fact that in Olam Haba, as it says in Gemara Brachas, Ein ba yachila v'shtiya, that there's no eating or drinking, it doesn't mean that the Maila, the greatness, the virtue of the Jewish body gets lost totally. That is totally not. But rather what it is saying is that the connection of body and soul is not going to be like it's now, by means of eating and drinking, basically materialistic eating and drinking, but rather that the guf, the body of the Jew, will become revealed in its fullest extent, and that the true energy, the true power will come from the body to the soul. Nowadays, the soul is what energizes the body. It gives the body life. In order to keep the two together, Hashem made it so that you have to eat and drink. But when Mashiach comes, They might be eating and drinking, but it won't be for this purpose. That's what the Gemara means. Why? Because the body will give energy to the soul. And of course, the soul doesn't need food in order to stay connected to the body. It's the body that needs food to stay connected to the soul. Now, we know that Chassidus, as we said in the introduction, rules like the Ramban, that the main thing of Elam Haba, what is really the ultimate extent is when we have neshamas begufim, then the neshamas will be back in the bodies. According to this, we can appreciate what Rabbi Yossi was encouraging, what the Rebbe Rashab is doing, by telling us that no, you do need to eat something. Why? Because this Suda, this meal corresponds to the Olam Haba, where then there will be revealed the Maila of the Guf. And tasting something, eating something, is definitely connected to the Guf. In other words, if we just did an action, like learning Torah, or just singing a song, which connects exclusively to the soul, it wouldn't bring out the value, the greatness of the body. And therefore, we need to eat something, and to have some pleasure that connects to the body, but at the same time, feel and appreciate that this is connecting us to the ultimate of times, the aspect of Hayoim Loi, which is the idea of I and the idea of not. Moreover, we know that the Seudas Livyasan Asher Habar, that will be when Mashiach comes, La'asid Lavoi, is not just a spiritual Seuda, like some want to explain, but rather it's a Suda Gashmis. It's a literal Seuda. Kipshutei Hashem will make a feast for tzaddikim, a physical feast. They're going to eat the food. They're actually going to eat the meat of the Livyasan and Sherabar. And of course, now we can appreciate the proof that he's bringing from Rabbi Yossi. Because, again, just to summarize, everything that we learned until this point, we could have said, well, if it's ayin, if it's hayoim loi, if this is talking about the correspondence to la'asid lavai, when ein boy achila v'shtiya, then don't eat anything at all. But now we can appreciate Rabbi Yossi is saying that there's an extra virtue here, above and beyond dafke in eating something, that you have to eat something, and that when the eating not only doesn't diminish the idea of loy, the concept of naught, but rather it celebrates it and it highlights it, this that will be la'asid lavai.